Hello. In this discussion, we're going to take a look at social psychology. We're going to start with a good working definition, and social psychology can be defined as the branch of psychology that involves basically how people think, how they feel, as well as how they behave in social situations. So let's focus for just a minute on that term, social situations. And so we just want to keep in mind, when we're talking about social situations, well, that's basically refers to situations where a person can be alone, or in the presence of others, or even in front of a crowd. Okay, and going just a little bit further, we also want to keep in mind that one's sense of self is very influential on basically how we interact with other people, how we basically use our cognition, how we use our emotions in that process of interaction. So a good definition of sense of self is, according to this, unique sense of our self-identity, which is influenced by social, cultural, and psychological experiences. Let's go just a little bit further. So there are two basic key research areas that we want to be aware of for social psychology. The first is what's called social cognition. Okay, and social cognition, that refers to how we form impressions of other people. So basically how we interpret the meaning of other people's behavior and how our behavior is in turn affected by our attitudes. So we're just talking, we're focusing a little bit about the mental processes that we engage in when we are basically interpreting other people's behavior and how our behavior is affected by our attitudes. Okay. The other key research area that we want to be aware of is what's known as social influence. And basically that's when we are more focused on how our behavior is affected by other people and by situational factors. So when we attribute our behavior as being the result of how somebody else is behaving or certain scenarios in which we are engaged that cause us to basically engage in different types of cognition that result in basically how we interpret the meaning of other people's behavior or how our behavior is being affected by our own attitudes. Okay, going forward. Okay, so we created this diagram right here because we'll take a look at this. Just bear with me. We will take a look at these in more. We'll kind of narrow our focus on each one of these a little more in depth. Okay, but basically at the very top here, we listed person perception. Okay, so how we perceive others, other people. Okay, and then they can be categorized in a certain way. Basically, that is social categorization. And please keep in mind, we will look at these in depth as we proceed. Okay, and that is closely connected to implicit personality theory. Basically, how we're implying how others, the reason why they are acting in such a certain way. Okay. And attribution, really closely related. Okay, when we're taking a look at different attitudes, especially attitudes of others or attitudes of ourselves, that can influence basically how we perceive others, as well as stereotypes. Okay, so right in the center of all that, you'll see that we put a note here that says social cognition. Remember, that refers to the mental processes that we people tend to use to make sense of our environment, our social environment. Okay, so when it comes to perceiving others, basically that is known as person perception. And person perception is basically mental processes that we tend to engage in order to form judgments about other people. Okay, so down below here we listed 4 key components or principles that influence our decision about making judgments about others. Okay, so the first of these is, characteristics of the person you're trying to evaluate. All right, so basically, certain characteristics that the other person might be demonstrating can influence our decisions and on how we perceive others. Okay, closely related to that is our own self-perception, as well as our own personal goals in the situation. And last but not least, the specific situation in which the process occurs. So we will take a little bit of a closer look in this. So definitely the characteristics of the person we're trying to evaluate. We're looking at categorization. Okay, so shortcuts in our personal perception, putting people in categories. So that is the mental process of categorizing people into groups or social categories on the basis of their shared characteristics. Okay, and so I listed a couple things right here, a couple terms down below here. And so the first of these terms is explicit cognition. That is, explicit means basically that's when we are consciously engaging in certain processes. So that tends to be deliberate, conscious mental processes involved in how we perceive, how we judge, how we make decisions, and in our reasoning processes. Okay, and then you'll notice in parentheses on the second phrase right here, I said implicit cognition. So implicit cognition basically just refers to basically automatic or unconscious mental processes that tend to influence our perceptions and judgments, decisions, and reasoning processes. And the third term I would like to make you aware of is at the bottom of this slide, and that is called implicit personality theory right here. Okay, so basically that just refers to is basically we have a network of certain assumptions or beliefs about the relationship among different types of people and their traits or their behaviors, and that leads to the use of basically what we call cognitive schemas. So that is implicit personality theory. Moving forward. Okay, so when we when it comes to one of those schemas, you might remember I mentioned the term schema a little bit earlier. One of the schemas basically is attractiveness. So attractive people, they are, generally they tend to be perceived as being more intelligent, kind of happier and better adjusted. Okay, and so Also, they tend to be higher in self-esteem, intelligence, and other desirable personality traits than people of more average appearance. And last but not least, attractive people, they tend to receive a little more attention and more favorable treatment from other people throughout their lives. Okay, so, such as, favorable treatment from their parents, from their teachers, from peers and employers. Okay, so you might notice from this picture right here, in the lower right here, well, that is a scene basically from the film. It's a Disney film called Enchanted. Okay, and basically, you notice that the sweet, innocent princess on the left, tends to be beautifully dressed and perfectly groomed. Okay, but the person on the right is the wicked stepmother. Is, an old woman, complete with a wart on her chin. A little bit less attractive for most. That's just an example of how, the schema of attractiveness works. So, because we're culturally conditioned, to associate beauty with goodness and evil with ugliness. Okay, moving forward just a little bit. All right, so when we're talking about attractiveness, well, from the neuroscientific perspective, well, certain parts of our brain actually activate when we see basically an attractive person that is making eye contact with us. Okay, so on the top left-hand side, you can see that this lady is directly looking into the camera, hence eye contact, and then the non-eye contact face is on the right-hand side, okay? Well, the eye contact, remember I said that kind of ignites, certain parts of the brain, and I went ahead and listed a couple of those. Direct eye contact with a physically attractive person, well, that activates what's called the ventral striatum, or striatum, however you like to pronounce that, okay? And so that's the part of the brain, that tends to predict reward. Like, hey, good things are going to happen here, and you'll be rewarded for, this beauty will, result in something positive for oneself. Be rewarded for that eye contact. Okay, a couple other areas here I did list, is the orbital frontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala. And those are all responsive to the reward value of attractive faces. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so when it comes to explaining behavior, some of the terms that we talked about a little bit earlier on that circle of examples, basically one of those was attribution. That's like how we tend to explain behavior, others' behavior as well as our own. But so attribution, that's the mental processes. Okay, that is, remember, that refers to cognitive processes of inferring the causes of other people's behavior, including our own behavior. Okay, so I listed a few of the common attributional biases and explanatory patterns. So basically, how we tend to be biased, okay, in how making those inferences, and how those biases basically affect how we explain why the behavior, the explanatory patterns. Okay, so we're going to take a look at these. Feel free to pause the video after each one of these and jot down some notes if you're seeking to gain further insight into these and to think about these. Okay, so one of these attributional biases is what's called fundamental attributional error. So basically, that fundamental attributional error, that refers to, basically, it's kind of like the tendency to attribute the behaviors of other to their own internal and personal characteristics, while ignoring or underestimating the effects of their external situational factors. Okay, so basically that just is saying, hey, this person is behaving this way because that's the kind of person they just are, and that we're not taking into account that the certain scenario, might be responsible for their behavior. Okay, the second bias is what's called actor-observer bias. And basically, well, that's kind of when we attribute our own behavior to external situational characteristics, while we ignore or underestimate the effects of our internal personal factors. So what I mean by that in easier language, basically, well, when we take, we attribute our own behavior because we might say, hey, that's just the way I am. I tend to be a successful, motivated person. Well, that is actor-observer bias. Okay. The third type of bias is what's called blaming the victim. And that's just when we tend to, we blame an innocent victim of misfortune for having somehow caused the problem, or for not having taken the steps that were necessary in order to avoid or prevent it from happening. Okay, the next type of bias is what's known as hindsight bias. Okay, and that's basically, that's the tendency to overestimate one's ability to have foreseen or predicted the outcome of an event. So hindsight bias is basically when one hears something or sees something like that, somebody tells them something and they go, oh yeah, I already knew that. I knew that, even though they may not have. So they're, tending to basically overestimate their own ability. Okay, so the self-serving bias basically just refers to, well, that's when we want to basically protect our self-esteem, save face, when we're facing failure. So engaging in certain types of behaviors or something so we don't look bad. We're trying to basically protect our sense of self-esteem and how we look to others. Okay, the last type of bias is what's known as self-effacing bias. And that's when we tend to blame ourselves for our failures, and we attribute them to internal personal causes. And, and kind of downplay our success by attributing that to external situational causes. So basically that's just saying, hey, I failed because I always fail. I'm just not a successful person. That kind of thing. Even though, one's failure might be due to situational external causes. Okay, so when we use attitudes, we can use our certain attitudes about things as ways to justify when injustice or discrimination or prejudice occurs. So basically justifying if something is not just. Okay, so anyway, let's take a look at some of these. So basically, the just world hypothesis is the assumption that life is fair. Okay? So, so sometimes, it might seem, kind of horrible that you can be a good person and bad things could happen to you anyway. All right? So, like, wow, I can't believe this happened. That person or myself, don't deserve that. Okay? So that kind of hypothesis, by the way, that tends to lead to, like blaming the victim. So when others, experience something, we say, hey, that's their own fault. They brought it on themselves. Okay? They deserve that. Okay, but the next bias down in the middle here is self-serving bias. And basically that's when people, they tend to credit themselves for their successes and to blame their failures on external circumstances. So if something good happens, they go, yep, I did this. And if something bad happens or they don't feel successful, then they blame it on something else or somebody else. Okay. Now, the self-effacing bias, basically, that's in more collectivistic type cultures. Well, that involves blaming their failures on themselves, on internal personal factors, while attributing success to external situation factors. Okay, so basically, when that refers to when a person doesn't experience success, they tend to blame it on themselves. But if they do experience success, they will attribute that to basically somebody or something else outside of themselves, like a family or a certain type of scenario that that they didn't originate within themselves. Okay, and finally here we're going to take a look at fundamental attribution error. Okay. And so that's basically the tendency to spontaneously attribute the behaviors of others to internal personal characteristics while ignoring or underestimating the role of situational factors. So it might sound familiar. We did talk a little bit about that earlier. And so basically that just means when somebody is not acting in a certain way that we feel that is acceptable or successful or something, we tend to blame it on them. We say, hey, that's because they're just that kind of person. And we tend to kind of ignore basically what they might be going through in life, what might be happening in their lives. Okay, going forward here. Okay, so when we're going to talk about a little bit about the social psychology of attitudes, well, we kind of want to be, before we proceed on, kind of analyzing this slide here, we just kind of want to keep in mind that the term attitude, basically, that is our tendency that we learn. It's a learned tendency to basically evaluate objects, people, or issues in a particular way. Okay? So that is one's attitude. They tend to evaluate, people or issues in a particular way, or even objects. Okay, so basically when it comes to talking about attitude, well, there's three different components that we want to focus on for a minute, and that is the cognitive components. Okay, so basically, our thoughts and conclusions about a topic or a situation. Okay, and the affective, that's our feelings or emotions about a certain topic. Okay, and last but not least, the third component is behavior or behavioral, and that's actions that we perform regarding the topic or situations. Okay, so example here is in this photo here, right here. There's student protesters from India. You know, they're calling for an end to basically large dam projects in their country. And so these students, they tend to believe that large dams have a negative environmental impact, especially on parts of the country downriver from the dams. Okay, so they hold strong opinions and express themselves openly. And so they have a certain attitude, okay? They're evaluating objects or issues in a particular way. Okay, so we talked about, the different components of attitudes. Okay, and so we talked about the cognitive components, the affective or attitude, basically the behavioral component. All right, excuse me, as well as the emotional component. Okay, so the cognitive component. Whenever we hear the term cognitive, we always just want to stay aware that that refers to thinking processes. Okay, how we are thinking. And the behavioral component, well, basically that's our predisposition to act in a particular way. And so I gave some examples here about fast food. Okay, I will not elaborate on these. Feel free to pause the video and look at these examples here. Okay, and the final component is emotional component. So basically how we feel about how we feel about an attitude, and so a good example here is like this person is saying fast food is disgusting. I hate their greasy fries and their fake milkshakes. Okay, and so etc. etc. So that is more of an emotional type response. But remember, we're talking about the social perspective of psychology or a branch of psychology. And we want to keep in mind that we're talking about, well, how we socially interact with our environment. Okay, so feel free to pause the video here and come up with as many answers as you feel you can. This is not a test, but basically, just kind of check out what you think and what you feel about this. Okay, so here is the sentence to complete. Basically, you are most likely to behave in accordance with your attitudes when. So, feel free to pause the video here, come up with some examples, and we'll talk about this in just when you come back. Okay, welcome back. So, some of the answers that we came up with here, basically, you're most likely to behave in accordance with your attitudes when, first of all, we anticipate a favorable outcome or response from others for behaving that way. Okay, another answer is basically our attitudes are extreme or are frequently expressed. So we tend to behave in accordance with our attitudes when those attitudes are extreme or expressed very frequently. Okay, and another answer is Well, we behave in accordance with our attitudes when they are based through direct experience, through repetition. Okay? Or we tend to behave in accordance with our attitudes when we are very knowledgeable about a certain subject. Okay, and last but not least, we tend to behave in accordance with our attitudes when we have a vested interest in the subject, and we basically stand to gain personally or lose something on a specific issue. So we either stand to gain or to lose in a particular situation. Hope this helped. Let's go a little bit further. Okay, so we're going to start talking about interpersonal attraction and liking. So basically, what tends to make us find another person more attractive than others? And so, I listed a few of the personal characteristics, things like trustworthiness. They tend to be warm or adventurous, or they might have social status. Tend to be a popular person. Okay. And when it comes to physical appearance, well, there's a lot to look at here, so these are all, pictures of what others consider to be attractive individuals. Okay, so they might have big smiles, wide smiles, and high eyebrows. Their pupils might be dilated, and their lips are full. They have full lips, and but men and women tend to find those attributes a little more attractive. Okay, and so let's go a little bit further here. And so basically, some of the there's other aspects too. So things like, we tend to be attracted to, people who are a lot like ourselves, perceive as being like us, have similar values and certain, behavioral aspects, things like that. Okay? Or people who are more familiar, people we tend to see on a regular basis, and like, oh yeah, I know this person. Okay, and then last but not least, one of the last aspect here that we have listed here is the socioeconomic and cultural environment. So this gets to be pretty interesting. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, but definitely, studies have shown that basically, men tend to, in a certain society in their society, where their food and resources are in short supply, well, they tend to prefer heavier women. Whereas, if they tend to be in a environment where basically resources are more abundant, men tend to prefer thinner women. Just some examples for you. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Okay, so we're going to talk about, how does our behavior, or how do others' behavior affect our attitudes? Okay, so there's a term here I put in bold font, which is cognitive dissonance. Okay, and so basically cognitive dissonance, a good oh, excuse me there. Sorry about that. I was experiencing technological issues. Cognitive dissonance, basically well, a good definition would be basically when we feel unpleasant, we have an unpleasant state of psychological tension. That is dissonance. And the cognitive part of that occurs when there's an inconsistency between two thoughts or perceptions. Okay, so we might experience cognitive dissonance, when we're in a situation and we are actually perceiving that situation as being, well, it's kind of both good and bad. And we might experience a little bit of cognitive dissonance, like which way do we go with this, Okay, so cognitive dissonance, as listed here, it tends to be very unpleasant, and it causes people to be strongly motivated to reduce that feeling, that cognitive dissonance. Okay, and but what is interesting here from the psychological perspective is, well, cognitive dissonance, can lead us to quickly adjust our attitudes without even realizing it. Okay, and you see in parentheses here, I did put social neuroscience research, and basically that suggests that cognitive dissonance can lead to attitude change very quickly, perhaps without us even realizing that the process is occurring. Okay, moving forward here, and I promise we're going to elaborate a little bit further in just a moment on all of this, okay? So when it comes to cognitive dissonance, here's an example. I thought it would be best to basically kind of, just talk about this a little bit. So people, they have a tendency, they want to seek ways to decrease their discomfort caused by any type of inconsistency that they are basically seeing or assessing. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, so if one can rationalize or explain one's behavior, well, the cognitive dissonance or the conflict or the tension, that is tends to be eliminated or avoided even. But if we can't explain our behavior, we sometimes, if we can't explain it, we tend to possibly change our attitude so that it's in harmony with our behavior. Okay, so that right there, feel free to pause the video here and take a look at this. I actually gave the examples right here, so this is basically when one changed one's attitude, right down below here, the attitude change right here, participant number 2, okay, as a result of the cognitive dissonance, all right, and that caused them to change their behavior and their attitude in order to, experience a little bit less of the issue. Okay, participant number 1 at the top here, this is the individual that basically did not really experience any conflict, didn't know cognitive dissonance, so they ended up not even changing their attitude. So they had the same attitude as they had in the beginning. You can see right here, their original attitude was, ooh, eating grasshoppers? Yuck. And then at the very final attitude, no attitude change. They said, eating those grasshoppers was disgusting. So feel free to pause the video here and take notes or just look at it a little bit at your own pace. Okay. we're going to switch gears just a little bit here, and we're going to talk about, well, how do we understand prejudice when we tend to have prejudice against others? Okay, so that's basically prejudice. A good definition is negative attitude toward people who belong to a specific social group. So things, I gave some examples like racial and ethnic groups. Okay, that's a specific group. Any differences that may exist between members of different racial and ethnic groups are far smaller, than differences among various members of the same group. Okay, going forward here just a little bit here. Give me just a moment here. There we go. Okay, so also certain stereotypes can lead to prejudice as well. Holding on to certain stereotypes. So basically, stereotypes, you can see here I put typically include qualities that are unrelated to the objective criteria that define a given category. Okay, so, well, so basically a cluster of characteristics associated with all members of a specific group or people. That's another way of looking at stereotype. And another way to look at it is when we hold a certain belief of one group, when we're a member of one group, and we hold certain beliefs about members of another group. Okay, so at the very bottom of this, as we're talking about stereotypes, that's can be kind of a controversial topic. But we tend to engage in stereotype. Basically, we want to keep in mind that individuals engage in stereotypical behavior because, well, that's a cognitive process that they engage in, to basically they're trying to simplify the social information that they are receiving. Okay. Just leave it at that. Okay, so we already talked about, certain, on this slide I just gave you some examples of certain stereotypes, okay? Okay, going forward. Okay, so when we're talking about stereotypes and prejudice, well, there's a couple of terms I want to make you aware of. The first of those is called the in-group, and that's when we tend to believe that basically a person is a member of our social group. Okay, that leads to in-group bias. And so in-group bias is the tendency to make favorable attributions to members of your in-group. Okay, the second term here that I want to have you focus on is the out-group. And basically that is, when we tend to attribute a certain person or a group of people as belonging to a different social group than our group. Okay, so the social group to which one does not belong. Okay, and so kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum is what's, from in-group bias is out-group homogeneity effect. And that's our tendency to basically see members of the out-group as more similar to one another. So that's basically, oh, blah and blah, they're all alike. They all just act this way, or they all think this way or behave this way. Okay, so take a look a little bit about prejudice and negative emotions, and we want to take a look a little bit. We want to look at that from the neuroscientific perspective. And so this right here is a functional MRI, fMRI, and basically that's examining the brains of participants viewing images of people often stereotyped as being incompetent. And so basically, in this study, participants who viewed these images, they showed higher levels of activity in the prefrontal cortex, as indicated here by the orange spot circled in red, right here. And that pattern occurs, when people experience pity, when one is having pity for someone else. That part of the brain is starting, the prefrontal cortex is starting to become more active. All right, let's take it a little bit further here. So you might remember here we use a couple of terms like implicit and explicit. So basically when it comes to attitudes, and especially prejudice, they've been, there's more subtle forms of prejudice according to psychologists. And those are, number one here in bold font, implicit attitudes. And that's basically when we evaluate a little more automatic, unintentional, and difficult to control. So our implicit attitudes, basically, they come from within ourselves, and they happen a little more automatically. We don't think about those. We don't filter those. So a little more difficult to control. Let's go forward. Okay. All right. So basically, this was called the Robbers Cave experiment. Okay, and that's when two groups of boys, they participated in a series of competitive games. So obviously, two groups, that led to rivalry, competitive rivalry. Okay. And that basically showed how group hostility could be created and then overcome. So basically, just being a member of one group basically can lead to more hostility toward another group. And that kind of makes sense, and one example we might witness quite often on television during sports events, certain individuals that are rooting for one team might tend to become a little more hostile or engaging in more hostility toward members of another group that will be rooting for the other team. It's just an example. Now we have to keep in mind here, what's important to keep in mind and look at a little more in depth, is basically this experiment. It demonstrated how group hostility could be created, but then how it could be overcome. All right, so we'll take a look at that just a little more in depth, So, they're basically their cooperation, they changed the tendency to categorize the out group from those people to we people. So that resulted in less negative stereotypes and prejudices, and a reduction in basically that intergroup hostility. So what is important to keep in mind from this part of the discussion is basically cooperation. Okay, cooperation between groups. Okay. and that will actually reduce the hostility that might exist between the two groups prior to that. And so, in this example, in this study, students, they were brought together to work on a mutual project. So they were cooperating. So remember, when individuals start to cooperate, they tend to see, a little bit less of those people and start to view everybody as we instead of they. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here just a little bit, and we're going to talk about basically what happens when we follow the crowd, when one tends to maybe experience that maybe they were engaging in behavior that they ordinarily would not do, but they just became part of the crowd. So as we're talking about this, we want to think, keep in mind, we want to talk about the term conformity. And conformity means basically, adjusting one's into behavior or opinions so that they match those of the other people or the norms of a social group or situation. So that might explain what happens, cognitively speaking, when an individual engages in behavior that is uncommon to them, but once they became a member of a certain crowd or a group. Okay, the second term I want to make you aware of and talk about a little bit is what's known as social influence. And basically, social influence is the study, psychological study of how behavior is influenced by the social environment and other people. So basically, social psychologists, are very interested in this. They want to know, hey, how does the environment and other people tend to affect the cognition and behavior of an individual? Okay, so this researcher, his last name was Ash. Okay, and he conducted the study about confirmation, and conformity, And so he basically, what Ash found is when it came to influence and everything, subjects, they reported doubt about their own perceptual abilities, which led to their conformance. So basically a self-identity and confidence in their own abilities can, be a factor in motivating a person to basically think or act in a way that is not usual for themselves. Okay, this is an example of Ash's study. We won't worry too much about this right now. Okay, we may talk about that in class, but we will not talk about that in this video. Okay, so culture and conformity. So conformity is higher in collectivistic cultures than in individualistic cultures. Okay, and I gave you some examples and of what an individualistic culture is. Okay, they tend to emphasize, independence for each person, each as to himself or herself. Okay, collectivistic cultures, they tend to be basically, a culture that tends to conform, even though they might privately disagree. with individuals or whatever, but they still tend to conform to the thoughts and behaviors and stuff of their like family or their society. Whereas in an individualistic culture, remember, that means, and each individual basically makes their own decisions and acts whatever way they want to that benefits them. Okay, I listed a few of the factors here. I just wanted to make you aware of that. Basically, some of the factors influencing conformity. All right. Feel free to pause the video here and take notes or just think about each of these. But basically, you're more likely to conform to group norms. And I will just give just a couple of examples, okay? Basically, down below here it says you doubt your abilities or acknowledge in a situation. So don't have a lot of confidence in your abilities or knowledge in a certain situation. So you might conform to the group norms. Okay, and last but not least here, at the very bottom here, I wrote strongly attracted to a group. And you want to be a member of it. So you're more likely to conform to the group norms when you want to be a member of that certain group. Okay. We don't have to go into too much elaboration on this slide. Just wanted you to keep in mind, though, that this person, Milgram, was a researcher, and he conducted a very, very famous, very well-known obedience experiment. Okay? And feel free to please look this up either on YouTube or Google this, and you will find the information about this, and we will talk about this in class, but we don't have enough time to go over this on the video right now. Okay, so just going forward here, want to just very quick, basically what Milgram found, in his research, basically that individuals, they might tend to, a certain percentage of them might turn to, doing something that they don't agree with naturally, but they do that because they might be influenced by, take for instance, somebody, I'm going to go back one slide here, just want to show you. Well, see, this individual here is wearing a lab coat right here. And so hence that person has a sense of authority. So this person sitting down is engaging in a certain type of behavior that he wouldn't ordinarily agree with or engage in, but because this person in the white lab coat has authority. And so we have to keep in mind, that definitely certain, when it comes to advertising and everything, if we ever noticed on television, we may see advertisements for a certain drug or a certain type of something that they are saying will make us feel better or something that will be good for us. And they usually will have a person talking about it for they're marketing that product, but the person talking about it usually will have a white lab coat, and so they're actually still referring, basically depending on how we're being influenced by that sense of authority by wearing a white lab coat.